Good day, my name is Eleanor Lowe and welcome to Open Studio. As part of Cape Town Television's mentorship production program, we're having a conversation called Elle-Vate now. Elle-Vate is all about sharing stories, celebrating and elevating colored leaders, creating change and making a difference in South Africa. Our guest today is Tarryn-Lee Bell. It's quite a long one, almost like a double barrel. Tarryn, thank you so much for joining us in Open Studio today. Now, Tarryn, it was the first moment that I met you before we came on set. And normally I do a bit of a homework and I do a bit of research, but this morning we're just going to have an open conversation as to who Tarryn-Lee Bell is. Tell us a bit about yourself and where you come from.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me, Eleanor.
You're more than welcome.
So my name is Tarryn. I hail from a beautiful area called Mitchell's Plain.
Okay.
What colour doesn't come from Mitchell's Plain?
I've had so many beautiful people, so I commend all of you coming from Mitchell's Plain.
I was born there and raised there for about 11 years of my life.
Okay.
So most of the beginning and my roots are there. I am the middle child of 3 children initially. My parents then they sort of got involved in welfare work and we adopted 3 kids.
Wow.
So I was born and raised in the church. So much of my life was in and around the church and the community. I have 5 siblings and we stayed there up until I was 11 and then moved to Athlone, an area called Balthorn. That was less township. Quite the leafy suburbs for Athlone, and there I stayed for the best part of my adolescent life.
And you do, so now a social development practitioner.
Yes, I studied development.
What is studying development?
So it's community development. It's really sociology and looking, so looking at communities and how they interact with one another, but ultimately responding to poverty. And within a South African context, it's really looking at what makes communities lack. Why are they under-resourced? Why is there the Cape Flats? And I initially wanted to do psychology because I think the purpose in my heart was about humanity and the well-being of humanity. And then I went to varsity and I came across community development, where it's looking at systems and bigger thinking around people collectively and how to look at how they respond and work with the assets that they have and mobilize them to enrich them.
So you were always interested in social change? Would you call yourself a bit of a social activist?
I think absolutely. When you're studying something, when you're studying development, you're an activist by heart. There's something inside of you that looks at systems and think something is wrong here. And not just wrong for today, but why is it wrong? Why do we have 3 or 4 generations of people standing in a soup kitchen? What made them get there? So it really changed my life, specifically looking at why South Africa is poor. Our recent apartheid regime that people don't want to speak about, but a lot goes back there. And so looking at what happens, some of the inequalities and injustices and really redressing those issues and looking for solutions.
Yes. Now, earlier you mentioned that you thought about studying psychology, sociology and psychology. It's almost synonymous that the two would go hand in hand. What would you say is the psychology of our past that brought about the lack of resources?
I think a lot of it, we could look at a lot of tangible things, but I think a lot of what has happened to us as a people is the issue of identity.
Correct.
And the issue of trauma. And when I speak about trauma, collective trauma and then intergenerational trauma.
What is intergenerational trauma?
So it comes before you in your mother's home. It's been passed down to mom. Before mom even conceived you, and so through conception and while you're in the belly, so it goes back to our grandparents and what happened around, what happened with them, and because we didn't have the necessary tools to address them, it just keeps going and it becomes culture and the way of life. That we shout at each other or we don't know how to resolve ordinary conflict or huge conflict. It just becomes a way of life.
You know, there's a poem, children learn what they live.
Yes.
Children learn what they see. Is that a major challenge in our communities? You just said when children are being shouted at, then that child becomes a mom and would do the same to their child. I'm possibly looking, is there possible solutions? How can we address that?
Oh, that's a huge, it's a packed question. But I think to answer the first part of your question, absolutely. Children, they enact everything that they see, whether it's in the home, whether it's seeing mom dress up, wearing heels, whether it's shouting. It becomes ordinary for us to shout that your course is op die tafel. And then looking at specifically the Cape Flats around gangsterism, it becomes culture. It becomes a way of life that there's nothing else to almost mimic but the guy on the corner or the girl on the corner.
Correct. And now it becomes the norm.
It becomes the norm. So addressing it is not necessarily just finding the person a job. Is to take decades of unlearning that practice and that mindset. So there's definitely solutions, but it's definitely not a one-stop shop or a one-prong approach. It's really looking at solutions that's going to change a system.
Yes.
And that's long-term and commitment.
Now, when we speak about systems, there's something that you did whilst working at social development, and it was a system that you put in place for community development. Tell me a bit more about community development and then the system that you put in place.
Okay, it was a project. So I started in the best part of my career was actually in Athlone. I was a practitioner and worked with various communities ranging from Langa, Manenberg, Heideveld to Nova Park. So a lot of them has they have a lot of things in common.
What would be the commonalities?
The commonalities is the socioeconomic issues. It ranges from really huge unemployment rates to issues around idleness. You go down the one road in Manenberg and almal staan op die hoek, and those that are talking or playing, and then there's others that is just loafing. And then issues around hunger. There's hunger in our communities. We're looking at issues of poverty and poverty-related issues. And then the assets that we have in the communities, issues such as Ubuntu, issues of welfare and neighborliness that is there. So there were those things, but I specifically managed a program called Sustainable Livelihoods.
Tarryn, before we take a break, I just want to ask you, when we come back, would you speak a bit more about sustainable livelihoods and also Ubuntu in our communities? It's such a buzzword, but do we have it in our own communities? When we come back, Tarryn's going to speak to us more about sustainable livelihood and Ubuntu in our communities. We're going to take a short ad break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Tarryn-Lee Bell. And we're back having a lovely conversation with Tarryn-Lee Bell. Tarryn's going to tell us a bit more about her personal journey, because this is what Elle-Vate is all about. Tarryn, before we speak about your personal journey, you did some work at the Child Protection Unit, and we spoke about sustainable livelihood and also Ubuntu. A lot of things, but there seems to be almost like a disconnect sometimes in communities regarding people, but there's something called neighborly love. And we always go back to social ills, but I also want to look at the positive aspect of what we have in communities. And, we call it Ubuntu in South Africa, but in the Cape Flats we always say there's a close-knit community. Like when I grew up, we knew our neighbors. If something went wrong, we could call on our neighbors. What is lacking? Why is it that people don't have that neighborliness where we look out for each other anymore?
I'm not even sure if I have the answer, but I think we've come to a stage in our lives where people are just trying to survive. The way we do things is very new. It's not business as usual. Even children are just trying to survive. They cannot play anymore. And we have it there, it is there, but if you're looking, if there's a fire in communities, people are basically just trying to grab what they have, and there's almost a sense of forgetting about the other one.
Now, you did some work with is it child protection, the child protection unit? What was that about?
So I was based in the Ministry of Social Development, and it came at a time where there was just a spike in child murders. In 2017, it was just over 200 children just within the Western Cape. So the look and the feel of these child murders was very different. The face of child protection changed. I then wrote a campaign that took child protection back to the home, because very often we are out there blaming government, and we're blaming this one and we're blaming that one. And the nature of the campaign was that child protection begins at home.
What does that mean?
And that to me is specifically that when the child goes to the shop, if the child needs to go alone to the shop, that you know when the child leaves, that you maybe go and stand at the gate. Because at the one case was, she went to her mom's boyfriend with grandmother. Grandmother was at home. She went outside. She went to go and sleep at mom's house. She never returned. Grandmother checked the next day. So who do we blame?
You don't want to blame anyone, but
you
don't the parents want to check where the child was?
And I mean, we grew up in the township. We knew that if we wanted to play outside hawks, Auntie was standing there, and every 5 minutes they would shout your name and you had to answer, and you dare not answer. So the campaign was really about putting it back there and giving communities tools to work with. And we know that we within a household now where it's not just the nuclear family. For years it's been grandmother, auntie and uncle.
We're living together.
We're all living together. And how do we live together within a community that's drenched with social ills?
Tarryn, I'm going to move on a little bit to Tarryn the person. Now, you went through your own personal journey, which I almost felt was a catalyst to where you're at now, but we'll get back to that later. Now, you suffered from depression since the age of 15.
Yes.
How did you know that you were suffering from depression?
I didn't know.
Really?
At 15, I think I was in standard 8. Now that would be grade 10. Man, I was suffering from anxiety, and at the time I didn't know that it was anxiety. I just had heart palpitations, there was a tiredness, and I wasn't feeling myself. I didn't know how to get out of this state. So it came like flu-like symptoms, but then it wouldn't just leave. This feeling of hopelessness and just not a normal bad mood.
Now, you mentioned anxiety, and that was quite physical. But depression, it's not always possible to diagnose it. What would you say should be the lookout signs for parents if their teenager or anyone suffers from depression?
I was crying a lot. I was crying, and usually as ladies you think, it's PMS.
Or you're just being emotional.
You're being emotional. But that serious feeling of despair that for days on end it's not leaving. And serious issues around not wanting to live.
Really?
I never ever said I was suicidal. I don't think I was suicidal because I didn't have the guts to end it all.
Thank God you're still sitting there.
But there was definitely a feeling of despair. Like, I don't know, everything feels cloudy and gloomy.
Did that carry on into your life or your livelihood? Is it something that you can overcome?
So let me go back and say what has happened. So growing up in the church and my parents being elders in the church, there wasn't any family problems, or so I thought. But I started feeling things in the home without my parents even fighting, that this marriage is falling apart.
Could you feel that?
I could feel it, I could sense it. And so not ever seeing or witnessing an unhappy home, because we were quite the lighthouse within the community. That's a space where our friends came and found almost wholeness there. Things were falling apart fast. And I then went for counselling as a 15-year-old, and then it became okay. In my matric year, my mom left.
Oh my! How did you cope with that?
I didn't cope at all. So I needed to finish matric. I needed to get through this matric. So it was a matric ball, and it was the euphoria around being in matric and being a young lady. But then towards the end of the year, things fell apart. I was abandoned.
Oh my! Do you feel that we put up walls to show the outside world that we find? You were saying there was the euphoria around matric and everything was just like you were the beacon of light, especially in church communities. People are broken down, but in church or in the community, people look up to them. How did you manage that?
I didn't manage it. I masked it because I wasn't going to be that child that come from a divorced home, because often that was frowned upon, even in my home. The child that comes there, it's always like, oh, shame. And here this thing happens to me. So we still carried on in matric like things were okay. And when it reached December, I think it was December 16th, Mom left. And then we couldn't mask anymore. Everything just unveiled, the curtains were open, and our mess was there for everyone to see. But then I had to carry on because I was left with my dad and my siblings.
And how many were you? Did you say 5 siblings?
So it was 4.
Yes.
And then Mom took the baby with her, which I think he was about 2 years old at the time.
And you grew up with your dad then?
So I grew up with my dad, and then afterwards, then conflict comes, and then it's a backwards and a forwards between Mom and Dad.
Were you caught in the middle of it all?
I was caught in the middle of it all, but I decided that was them and this was me, and I'm never gonna get divorced. It's a promise I made myself. And that's when I met my husband.
I want you to share a bit more about the time when you met your husband, and we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, Tarryn's going to share with us another aspect of her journey which grew to her ultimate growth and where she is now. Thank you so much for watching, and do keep watching Cape Town TV. And when we come back, please continue listening to Tarryn-Lee Bell. Thank you. And we're back with Tarryn-Lee Bell. When I heard about Tarryn-Lee Bell, it was through a mutual friend. And she said, Eleanor, you need to speak to her. She's a writer, she's a blogger, and there's a story behind all of it. I'm going to continue our conversation with Tarryn-Lee Bell. Tarryn, you mentioned that you got married. Tell us a bit more about your marriage, but I hope you don't mind sharing this with our viewers today. I believe when we share stories, hopefully it will touch another heart and can cause healing. You mentioned that you went to a co-abusive marriage, and the first thing that came to my mind was, what is a co-abusive marriage? And you also spoke about where you come from, with your family splitting up. Did that impact in your life as a young woman, now becoming a married woman? We spoke about generational, I don't want to call it generational curses, but it's as if we carry something within us, in our DNA. What is a co-abusive marriage?
So let me just take you a bit back about those wounds.
Yes.
So you carry those wounds with you and you patch it up.
Yes.
And I patched mine up nicely, and I met my husband, and at the time
How old were you when you met your
18.
husband? You were 18?
Yeah. So we were dating for 7 years, and this was that thing that the woman waits for, the prince on the horse coming to rescue me. And we were going to be one, and we got married, and after 7 years, but the wounds never left. And what I didn't know is that he was wounded too.
As well.
So you think it's this this half and half becoming, but it's not that.
It's two broken halves.
It's two broken halves, and relationships needs wholeness.
Correct.
So we started pulling each other's cabs. And so when we often speak about abuse where it's just one-dimensional, specifically with males and females, or men hitting women, but men, we hit each other.
Yes. Also with our words.
With words. I mean, I got totally ghetto.
I became all came out now.
I became Tarryn from Mitchell's Plain. So it was painful. It wasn't often, but we would get there, and I would provoke him because he would leave and he would abandon me. He would break up with me for weeks on end and come back. What I did know was that he really, really loved me, and he wanted to love me. I didn't know how to be loved and how to accept that love. And before we got married, in fact, our relationship was pretty wounded. My depression came back, and he helped me manage it, but it wasn't his lot to bear.
Correct.
I think 2 years, I think when we got married, I eventually ended up in a clinic.
Oh my.
Because I just didn't want to live anymore.
Were you then suffering from clinical depression?
It was. It was clinical depression with, and it always accompanies, it's like it's brother and sister, And when we got married, because that's all I ever wanted. I wanted this family that my parents didn't give me. It was okay until one day I woke up and I realized that I didn't want to be married to this man anymore.
And how did he feel about it?
He was devastated. He was fighting for it. I ended up in clinic, and I was in therapy for a very, very long time.
Okay.
And peculiar as this may sound, is that therapy helped me get out of the marriage.
Therapy helped you to get out of the marriage
Out
and
of
not
the marriage.
remain in the marriage.
We tried. We definitely tried, but I think the wounds of our past and what has happened was almost
Too deep.
it was too deep, and I was dealing with a wounded Tarryn. I didn't need all this messiness around me.
Yes.
And while in therapy, I realized who I was. I often had a vision of myself on a swing as a little girl,
Yes.
swinging alone without mom and dad.
So you felt abandoned, and you took that abandonment into your.
I took it into the
marriage
marriage, and
as
I wanted
well.
him to heal me.
Yes, and
I
you
wanted
couldn't
him
do
to nurture me. And when I came, I think therapy as this therapist opened my eyes that I'm never going to get mom and dad back.
Yes.
Everything that I need is within
Within
Tarryn.
you. Tarryn, I find this interesting because there's a woundedness in our community, there was a woundedness in you, but then you started writing about that.
Yes.
Rest in peace,
Children of the
Children
Cape
of the Cape-Flats. What inspired you to write that poem?
So I write. I didn't know I had it in me. I often journaled as a child.
And you have a blog.
And I have a blog called Naked Reflections with Tarryn Bell. And I started journaling a lot of who I am, because I feel that as religious people, and I wouldn't want to call myself religious, I think I'm more spiritual, is we mask and we want people to see
The perfect.
what we think they should see.
Yes.
And I thought, stuff it all.
Yeah.
I'm unmasking because
Yes.
there's another woman that needs that, and
Yeah.
there's another little girl that needs that. And so I write about my divorce.
Yeah.
I love saying it. I couldn't say it at first, and so I write about it. I write about the fact that I have a child, and I chose to have a child out of wedlock.
Yeah.
So the Rest in Peace Children of the Cape-Flats was around 2017, with the child from Elsie's River. I think it was Courtney Peters.
I remember that one.
She really inspired this piece where I ask all of society what has happened. Why is our communities in the state that they're in? And I speak to the government, and I speak to this man who I feel has failed us. I speak to the father in him, because he's supposed to father us, and yet he finds this child's genitals worthy to please him.
I'm glad that you're saying that we need to be more open about
Yes.
our pain and our hurts, and that we should also have a new narrative.
Yes.
You started your new story, the new Tarryn, because sometimes we can be very stuck in
Yes.
our old story, but we need to move through it. What would you say was the catalyst for you to start telling your new story, to take your mask and to break it down? What was that about?
So I think the catalyst is to acknowledge that it's
Yes.
there and it's going nowhere.
Yes.
That it's there and you need to feel it and acknowledge it, that it's a part of you.
Yeah.
But then taking that woundedness and story and turning it into something good,
positive.
something positive. Because when I write, I get 10 people at a time responding to say, I needed to hear that.
They can relate to it.
That they can relate to it. And so whether it's the issues, whether it's South Africa's story and our painful past, is that we don't just tell people move on.
Correct.
That we identify that pain is worth feeling.
Yes. And then to accept that, embrace that, and then to move on.
And then to accept it and to move on and use that story to heal
the
others.
Tarryn, on that note, I would like to end off our conversation called Elle-Vate, to take those wounds from the past, to expose it, and then to embrace it, but not only stay in our past, but to take it and heal it and to create change. Thank you so much for everyone watching Elle-Vate, and I look forward to one next season where we will share more stories of people creating change in the communities and South Africa. Tarryn, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. I'm sure there's someone out there that can relate to your story,
sure hope
and
so.
your story caused healing. Thank you.